Thank you for all being here today. I certainly appreciate your attendance. So if you would, please bow with me in prayer. Lord, our Holy Father, you are truly gracious to all of us. You've provided many great things for us. You've provided a nation that is free. You've provided this museum where we can gather today. You've provided the food that we ask your blessing upon. We give you great thanks for the Bronstein Foundation that supports this event. We give you great thanks for our volunteers and for those who've given the ultimate sacrifice and those who also still serve us today. And we ask on this special day, as we look forward to a new year, that your mighty hand would guide us, guide this nation, guide us the way that you would have us be. We ask this in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Larry Head will lead us in the Star-Spangled Banner.
Thank you, John. Please feel free to join in. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Very good.
Thank you so much, everyone. My name is Meredith. I am the administrator and manager here at the museum. I just was going to remind you about our upcoming couple of lunch and learns. The next one is on January 16th. We'll actually have a double header. There will be a brief presentation from a B-36 pilot beforehand, and then Stephanie Pitchers will be speaking afterwards about the war and how it affected fashion in the United States. We also have one February 6th about the United States Medal of Honor, and February 20th about the Weyerbaachers. They were both pilots in World War I and World War II. So hope to see you there. Our current speaker today is Daryl Hopple. Daryl has a master's degree in U.S. history from Indiana State University. He worked as a grad student on the Eugene V. Debs papers and was the curator of the Eugene V. Debs Museum and the Vigo County Historical Museum in Terre Haute. He's worked for State Farm for 35 years and is currently a volunteer docent with the museum. Welcome, Daryl.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I really look forward to speaking with you today and hopefully teaching you a little bit about the battle for Iwo Jima. You might be sitting here wondering what's so important. about Iwo Jima. You may have a lot of knowledge about it, you may have little knowledge about it. I will tell you that 22 Marines earned the Medal of Honor on Iwo Jima. 22. There were only 84 awarded during World War II to U.S. Marines. So over 25% of the Medals of Honor were earned by Marines at Iwo Jima. There were also 5 Medals of Honor awarded to Navy, 4 to corpsmen, and 1 to the captain of a landing craft infantry. February 19th this year will mark the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima. And the museum is planning an exhibit on the Battle of Iwo Jima. It's quite clearly, quite obviously, if you study history, the most important Marine battle of World War II. Songs have been written about it, movies have been done about it. Clint Eastwood did too, one from the Japanese perspective and one from the American perspective. Monuments have been built at Arlington Cemetery and at other places throughout the year. So Iwo Jima is an important point of the battle against Japan during World War II and an important part of our nation's history. Why invade Iwo Jima? Many in the audience today are familiar with the island hopping campaign of World War II. And you can see Iwo Jima is right here, some 700 to 800 miles from Tokyo. Many heavily defended islands were cut off during World War II. The Americans instituted an island hopping campaign. You can see some of the islands here that they took. Some of the most heavily defended islands were bypassed, and the Japanese were left to starve. The airfields were bombed. They were cut off from supplies and support from the Japanese Army and the Navy. The aircraft were eliminated and rendered ineffective for attacks on American forces. Other islands were seized for strategic reasons, such as completed airfields or spacious harbors within bombing range of the next island chain. But again, why invade tiny Iwo Jima, only 8 miles in size? It's only 8 square miles. It's located in the Bonin Islands, some 800 miles from Japan. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Ernest King, Admiral William Leahy, General George Marshall, and General Henry Hap Arnold, were created in 1942 to provide a body of high command to direct U.S. operations during the war. Each member was a 4-star officer from the U.S. Army, Navy, and Army Air Forces. This is a B-29 Super Fortress. It first flew in September 1942. The American Joint Chiefs of Staff decided to use the B-29 to bomb Japan. It was one of the largest aircraft of World War II. It included state-of-the-art technology, which included a pressurized cabin, dual-wheel tricycle landing gear, and an analog computer-controlled fire control system, which allowed 1 gunner and a fire control officer to direct 4 remote machine gun turrets. Now, like you, I had always assumed that the B-20, the atomic bomb project, was the most expensive project of World War II. The creation of the Manhattan Project. Now, the Manhattan Project to create the atomic bomb cost $1.9 billion. But the B-29 program was the most expensive of World War II. It cost $3 billion. The U.S. spent more on this one project than on any other, making it by far the most expensive of the war. The B-29 could climb to over 31,000 feet, above the service ceiling of many enemy fighters. Most importantly, it had a range of 3,250 miles, which will allow it to operate out of airfields in the Marianas Islands captured during a campaign in the summer of 1944. The Marianas Islands were developed into massive air bases which supported hundreds of B-29 bombers. These bases were located on the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. We saw those earlier, right here. So from those islands, the B-29 could attack Japan. However, this slide is of a P-51 fighter aircraft, the longest range aircraft that America had during World War II. They did not have the range to attack Japan from the Marianas Islands. General Arnold was of the opinion that the Bonin Islands could be useful for conducting B-29 Superfortress high-altitude raids on Japan. He was convinced that Iwo Jima, in particular, being halfway between the Marianas Islands and the Japanese capital, would place his P-51 fighter aircraft within range of Japan. Now, it had been discovered in European campaigns, strategic bombing campaigns, that fighter escort was essential to protect bombers from enemy fighters. Iwo Jima could also be used as emergency airfield for B-29s with mechanical problems, either on the flight toward Japan or with battle damage returning from Japan. At the time, the success of the atomic bomb was unknown. You have to remember that in the grand scheme of this, we didn't know if the atomic bomb was going to work. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff felt that Japan could only be defeated through a strategic bombing campaign, followed by an amphibious invasion of the Japanese islands. Thus, the need for Iwo Jima and those airfields closer to Japan. I think it's important, before we get into the talk about Iwo Jima itself, that we look at the Pacific Theater during World War II and gain an understanding of what was going on. American forces had battled against the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy in a series of island-hopping battles, as we discussed. The first island campaign was in Guadalcanal, August 1942 to 1943. Guadalcanal is a lot bigger island than Iwo Jima. It's the largest island in the Solomons, over 2,000 square miles. Most of it is dense jungle. The American forces were not attacked as they landed on Guadalcanal. The Japanese had not heavily fortified that island yet. They had a low opinion of the American military because they'd had a lot of early war victories. They underestimated the number of American troops which would take the island, and they slowly fed reinforcements into the battle rather than to commit American adequate forces. A few slides here showing Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal on the beach and in the jungle. And you can see that they are lightly equipped. They didn't have a lot of artillery, they didn't have tanks, and they could subsist on a handful of rice a day. The Japanese relied on the Bushido Code, which translates as the way of the warrior. It is a Japanese code of conduct associated with the samurai. Soldiers were fearless and fought to the death or committed suicide. The Japanese excelled at jungle fighting. They were poorly equipped, as I said, and their weapons were sometimes obsolete. But it's important to note that their military had gained a lot of war experience because they'd been fighting in China since 1931. They participated in banzai charges, which you may have heard of, in which waves of infantry attacked American positions seeking to overwhelm them by sheer numbers. The Japanese government supported these tactics, presenting war as purifying and death as a duty. These banzai charges were rarely successful, and hundreds of Japanese troops were killed by American machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery. This slide shows American Marines on Guadalcanal. There were banzai charges throughout the Pacific War. For example, on Attu in the Aleutian Islands, which was in May 1943, 2,600 Japanese infantry rushed the Americans. Only 28 survived. On Saipan, in the biggest banzai charge of the war, 4,300 Japanese attacked American positions. Almost all were killed. In planning for Iwo Jima, it was assumed the Japanese would again employ those banzai charges. In fact, the Japanese commander, knowing that they were unsuccessful, ordered that there would be no banzai charges on Iwo Jima. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about Tarawa. Tarawa Atoll was in the Gilbert Islands. The battle was fought in November of 1943. The Japanese decided that they needed to stop the invaders in the water as they encountered the island's reef system or on the beaches. Numerous fire pits were dug and pillboxes were constructed from coconut logs and sand, reinforced by concrete. Artillery was placed in concrete bunkers. Tarawa is very small, only 2 miles long and 800 yards wide. It was the most heavily defended atoll invaded by Allied forces in the Pacific. The battle was won by Americans in 3 days, but at a tremendous and horrendous cost. There were approximately 12,000 men in the 2nd Marine Division. Over 3,000 of them were killed, wounded, or missing after the battle. Of the Japanese garrison, only 17 survived out of over 3,600 Japanese troops. The American casualties at Tarawa resulted from several contributing factors, among which were the miscalculations of the tide, height of the obstructing coral reefs, the operational shortcomings of the landing craft, the inability of the naval bombardment to weaken the defense of the Japanese entrenchments, and the difficulties of coordinating and communicating between the different military branches involved. This is a slide, a photograph of an Amtrak. This is going to be an important part of the American campaign during World War II in the Pacific, and it has a connection to Evansville, which we'll talk about later. But as you can see, these were an amphibious tractor that could swim through the ocean, crawl over the coral reefs, and then go up the beaches. These were originally designed before the war in New Orleans. They were a civilian rescue craft for use in swampy areas. But the military version could carry up to 18 men. They were used for the first time at Tarawa. 125 of them took part in the first, second, and third waves in the initial assault on the beaches. They were found to be very helpful, and they were also used to carry ammunition, reinforcements, and wounded back to the transport ships. If you want to see one of those, there is an Amtrak at the Vincennes Military Museum. Higgins assault boats, which were basically large landing craft boats, got stuck on the reef surrounding the island, while these Amtraks, as I've said, crawled over that reef and went onto the beach. The Marine Corps recognized the value of Amtraks during the war, and they were continuously modified and adapted and improved. They added armor plate. Some of them were given modified tank turrets with 37 millimeter and 75 millimeter cannon. Amtraks were used in all subsequent amphibious invasions and played a key role at Iwo Jima. More about that later. Next, we're going to speak about Peleliu. Notice there's an Amtrak in the background of this photograph. Peleliu is about 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. The battle there took place in November 1944. The Japanese Imperial Army realized that their tactics were not working. They chose to abandon their old strategies of trying to stop the enemy on beaches because they were exposed to naval bombardment. The new strategy was at bogging the enemy invaders down for days and inflicting massive casualties in hopes of pushing the Allies into a negotiated peace to end the war. These new tactics would only disrupt the landings at the water's edge and depend on an in-depth defense further inland. The rough terrain on Peleliu was used to advantage by constructing a system of heavily fortified bunkers, caves, and underground positions, all interlocked in a honeycomb system. The traditional bonsai charge was also discontinued as being wasteful of men and ineffective, and in fact would not be instituted until late in the battle. These changes would force the Americans into a war of attrition, requiring more resources. There were approximately 11,000 Japanese troops on Peleliu. Only 200 survived. This gives you an idea of the terrain on Peleliu. Very rocky, very hilly. American Marines advancing through this terrain. Peleliu's defenses were centered on its highest point, Umbrogo Mountain, a collection of hills and steep ridges located at the center of Peleliu, overlooking a large portion of the island, including the crucial airfield. The Umbrogo contained some 500 limestone caves, connected by tunnels. Many of these were former mine shafts that were turned into defensive positions. Japanese engineers added sliding armored steel doors with multiple openings to serve both artillery and machine guns. Cave entrances were opened or altered to be slanted as a defense against grenades and flamethrower attacks. The caves and bunkers were connected to a vast tunnel and trench system throughout central Peleliu, which allowed the Japanese to evacuate or reoccupy positions as needed. The beaches were also filled with thousands of obstacles for American landing craft, including mines and a large number of heavy artillery shells which were buried, with the fuses exposed to explode when they were run over. A battalion was placed on the beach to defend against the landing, but they were meant to merely delay the inevitable American advance inland. Because of the jungle and terrain, American intelligence was unaware of the Japanese defensive positions in depth. This is a photograph of an Amtrak again in the front. But this is the battleship West Virginia behind it. Pre-invasion bombardment. A lot of people don't know, but of all the battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor, only 2 were never repaired. The rest were refloated, repaired, and reused throughout the rest of the war, as the West Virginia was sunk at Pearl Harbor, refloated, repaired, and used in pre-invasion bombardments. Unlike the Japanese, who dramatically altered their tactics for Peleliu, the American invasion plan was unchanged. A massive 3-day pre-invasion naval bombardment by 5 battleships and 7 cruisers opened the battle, and air attacks from 19 aircraft carriers hit the beaches. In reality, The Navy believed the bombardment had wiped out the Japanese on Peleliu. They in fact told the Marines they had run out of targets. Sadly, that was not the case. In reality, the majority of Japanese positions were unharmed. Even the battalion left to defend the beaches was virtually unscathed. During the pre-invasion bombardment, the island's defenders exercised unusual fire discipline to avoid giving away their positions. At Peleliu, Japanese forces opened fire as the American landing craft approached the beaches. Caught in a crossfire, Americans suffered heavy casualties. At the end of the first day, the Americans held a 2-mile stretch of landing beaches, but little else. The Marines had suffered 200 dead and 900 wounded. The Marine commander, still aware of his enemy's change of tactics, believed that the Japanese would quickly crumble since their perimeter had been broken. In fact, the Battle of Peleliu, which was predicted to last for 3 days, went on for a total of 73 days. The Battle of Peleliu resulted in the highest casualty rate of any battle in the American military amphibious assault history. Of the 28,000 Marines and infantry troops involved, a full 40% of the Marines and soldiers were died or wounded, for a total of almost 10,000 men. Now that made the battle for Peleliu very controversial in the United States. Many felt that too many Americans were lost for an island that had little strategic value. The defenders lacked the means to interfere with potential U.S. operations in the Philippines, and the airfield captured on Peleliu was not used to a great extent following the battle. I know I'm giving you some numbers, and it's a lot of numbers, but I want us to think about one thing. After the war, statisticians calculated that it took U.S. forces over 1,500 rounds of ammunition to kill each Japanese soldier. 1,500 rounds. More numbers. Americans expended 13 million rounds of 30 caliber, 1.5 million rounds of 45, 700,000 rounds of 50 caliber, 118,000 hand grenades, and 150,000 mortar rounds on Peleliu. The Evansville connection. If you studied Evansville, you know that over 3 billion rounds of 45 caliber ammunition and 500 million rounds of 30 caliber ammunition was manufactured at Evansville's ordnance plant. Here's the question. Would American commanders learn from the Battle of Peleliu and apply these lessons to Iwo Jima? The lessons learned at Peleliu gave U.S. commanders and forces insight into the new Japanese strategy of attrition. But Allied overconfidence in the efficacy of pre-landing naval bombardment would continue, as well as a poor understanding of Iwo Jima's unique terrain and overconfidence on the part of Marine commanders. This is obviously a map of Iwo Jima. You can see the 2 airfields. You can see Mount Suribachi. This is where the Americans would land. And this is the north side of the island, which was the most heavily defended. Iwo Jima, pre-battle assumptions were that Iwo Jima, as a volcanic island, was about 8 square miles in size. It's about 800 miles from Japan, as we've discussed. The highest point on the island is Mount Suribachi at 564 feet. At the time of the battle, there were 2 Japanese airfields on the island. There was very little vegetation on Iwo Jima, and the island is remarkably flat for a volcanic island other than for Mount Suribachi. The civilian population was gone. they had been forcibly removed by the Japanese government in 1944. The American military made many false assumptions prior to the battle. American commanders felt the battle would be won in a week or less. In reality, the battle went on for 36 days, February 19th to March 26, 1945. The Americans thought there were 12,000 Japanese defenders on the island. In reality, there were over 21,000. The Americans thought that Iwo Jima's sand beaches would support the weight of manned vehicles. In reality, the Marines faced 15-foot high slopes of soft, black, volcanic cinders and ash as they crossed the beach. It was difficult to walk through that terrain, and vehicles, four-wheeled vehicles, bogged down. Amtraks and tanks had to be used to tow wheeled vehicles out of the sand. Marines could not dig foxholes in the sand to protect themselves from hostile fire because sand would just collapse. The Marines thought the Japanese army would again rely on the Banzai attacks as they had on Guadalcanal, Attu, and Saipan, or that the Japanese would use coastal beach defenses like they did on Tarawa, as we've discussed. Actually, the Japanese defenses were more like those on Peleliu, complex and inland with 11 miles of tunnels, with over 750 major defense installations in caves, tunnels, pillboxes, and hidden gun sites. The Japanese commander did not try to defend the beaches where his troops would be subject to pre-invasion bombardment. Rather, his defenses were situated back, overlooking the beaches. Like at Peleliu, Japanese strategy was aimed at bogging the enemy's invaders down for days and inflicting massive casualties in hopes of pushing the Allies into a negotiated peace. The Allies had demanded an unconditional surrender, and the Japanese, trying to protect their emperor, would not agree to that. As in previous amphibious attacks, American aerial bombardment and naval bombardment would destroy Japanese defenses and military personnel. Marine Major General Harry Schmidt wanted a 10-day pre-invasion bombardment. He was granted only 3 days. The bombardment was ineffective due to poor weather and well-constructed and camouflaged Japanese defenses. In fact, Japanese preparations were so effective, little damage was done to defenses or personnel. As the Americans came ashore, the Japanese held their fire, and they waited until the Americans and their vehicles were bogged down in that soft volcanic sand against those 15-foot high embankments. They waited, the Japanese defenders waited underground for 1 hour after the landings. Then they opened up. Hidden artillery mortars and machine guns had a devastating effect on concentrated American forces still struggling to get off the beaches. Some more photographs of American Amtraks headed for the beaches. One of these Amtrak platoons was commanded by Second Lieutenant Robert Norton, who has an Evansville connection. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. American Amtraks unload supplies on the beach. Here in the front. Notice the LSTs in the background, like the ones that were built in Evansville. Off, still in the bay, coming in, unloading tanks and equipment. Another slide of American, and as Americans advance across the beaches, there's another Amtrak, the terrain, the black sand. American Marines rest on the beach, and there is Mount Suribachi in the background. Just to kind of give you an idea of what that looked like. Another slide of the American forces. There's Mount Suribachi in the background, obscured by smoke, but you can see that 15-foot embankment around the beach and how difficult it was for them to advance. Now, my intent is not to cover the battle day by day. Ladies, I know you want that. But I'm not going to go over the battle day by day. But I want to give an overview of the key dates and outcomes. As we've discussed, the battle began on February 19th. Landings on the southeast side of the beach of the island at 9 a.m. The Marines advanced 800 yards, a half mile across the island, hoping to cut off Mount Suribachi. They also reached the tip of one of the Japanese airfields. 30,000 men landed by evening. The beachhead was roughly 4,000 yards long and 700 to 1,100 yards wide. One battalion, the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Marines, landed that morning with 900 men. By the end of the day, those 900 men had been reduced to 150. 750 Marines were wounded or killed by nightfall. If you study World War II, specifically the Pacific, you might know the name John Basilone. John Basilone was a gunnery sergeant, a Marine who had received the Medal of Honor on Guadalcanal. He didn't have to be there, but he wouldn't leave his men, so he took part in the Iwo Jima invasion as well. He was killed on the first day. He received the Navy Cross. He was the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. At this point, I'm going to take an interruption from the battle. Let's see what's going on back in Evansville. Okay, somewhere. Going the wrong way. Okay, back in Evansville. As you can see from the Evansville Courier, the headlines on February 20th, one day after the battle began, read, "Flaming Battle for Iwo Jima Rages." That's the headline. "Fighting is terribly bloody," says eyewitness watching Iwo conflict from plane, aboard a Navy Liberator bomber over Iwo Jima. This is a quote from the article. "After nearly 4 hours under fire in one of the toughest beachheads ever wrestled from the Japanese, American Marines tonight held the southern end of the triangular No. 1 airfield on Iwo Jima, a rugged little island 750 miles southeast of Tokyo. From this Liberator, only 1,000 feet above the struggling Leathernecks, I watched them this afternoon as they plunged inward from the hotly contested beach and reached the edge of the airfield. This evening, this airfield is no man's land, with the Marines and Nipponese stalking each other over volcanic rock." I think it's interesting for us to know that how accurate this news story is and how fast it's being reported back in the United States. This is on February 20th, the day after the battle began. And by this stage in the war, life was pretty normal here in Evansville. Look at this ad. Post Raisin Bran, delicious new breakfast idea. Heinz condensed soup. You could, at the A&P, you could get pineapples for 27 cents to 33 cents. An 8-pound bag of oranges was 49 cents. There was no shortage of food, unlike where in Britain, where food was still strictly rationed until the 50s. But you could see what life was like back in Evansville just based on the grocery ad. Notice, ladies, you could buy a spring dress for $8.99. Pair of pants, $5. Skirts, $3 to $4. And for anybody wanting to get married, you could get a deluxe diamond set for $218. Beer by the case. Lux soap, 23 cents. Life was pretty normal back in Evansville at that time. The one ads had employment listing for hundreds of jobs, including companies like Republic Aviation, building that P-47, and for Briggs Company. There were hundreds of openings. Now back to the battle. This, of course, is Mount Suribachi being captured by the Marines. It's an iconic Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph by Joe Rosenthal. In many ways, this photograph symbolized the Marines in World War II and their efforts. On February 21st, 50 Japanese kamikaze planes attacked U.S. naval ships. Only one small escort carrier was sunk, and there was severe damage to a large fleet aircraft carrier, the USS Saratoga. Other ships received lesser damage. This was the only aerial kamikaze attack mounted during the battle and did not affect the outcome. Mount Suribachi was captured by American forces supported by naval gunfire, close air support, naval aircraft, and Marine artillery on February 23rd, 2 days after the start of the battle. It had been defended by 2,000 Japanese troops in honeycomb caves and tunnels. They were used to shift troops to various defensive positions. The Japanese inflicted up to 50% casualties on assaulting forces. Again, the American flag was raised, captured in this photograph by Joe Rosenthal. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner. It was one of the most significant and recognizable photographs of the war. There's a monument in Arlington National Cemetery, a granite monument. The Secretary of the Navy was present at the battle. This was James Forrestal. The Secretary of the Navy said, "The raising of that flag on Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years." The Evansville Connection. On February 26, 1945, Marine Private First Class Leonard Logal was killed on Iwo Jima. He was only 19 years old. He is buried in St. Joseph Catholic Cemetery in Evansville. You might know Leonard's brother Gene. He was 17 at the time, and he was the football team captain at Memorial High School. He went on to start at the University of Evansville and became the head football coach for Memorial High School from 1957 to 1980, and was inducted into the High School Football Coach Hall of Fame for Indiana. Also buried in St. Joseph Catholic Cemetery in Evansville is Oscar Hart, a U.S. Marine officer who also started as a football player at Memorial High School. He played there in 1937 and 1938, earning all-state honors. He went on to play for Georgetown University in the Orange Bowl. After college, Mr. Hart joined the Marines and became a highly decorated officer, seeing action at Roy Namur, the Marshall Islands, Tinian, and Iwo Jima, where his 4th Division suffered 28% casualties. He earned a Bronze Star and the Presidential Unit Citation. Mr. Hart returned to Evansville and lived until 1990. As we've discussed, another Marine with Evansville connections was 2nd Lieutenant Robert Norton, who commanded an Amtrak platoon. He was wounded in the neck on the first day, treated, and returned to battle again in later days. He survived Iwo Jima, and his son Thomas would go on to have a career as an attorney in Evansville. By March 4th, both Japanese airfields were captured. Marines had advanced 4,000 yards north at a cost of 7,000 casualties. American forces had encountered new Japanese tactics, well-coordinated and well-led counterattacks. Japanese strongpoints were impervious to bombing by aircraft and artillery fire. Americans found that rifle and machine gun fire was not effective and are forced to resort to flamethrowers, satchel charges, and hand grenades to destroy enemy positions and seal off ground openings. Many heavy artillery weapons were out of commission, but Japanese continued to take a heavy toll on American attackers. Japanese used landmines, camouflage positions, and suicide squads to put supporting American tanks out of action. Troops used tunnels to emerge above ground behind American lines. The first B-29 emergency landing was made on Iwo Jima. This kind of shows you how the Japanese would come out of a tunnel behind the American lines. Shows American Marines resting outside a heavy artillery bunker. March 7th, northern Iwo Jima contained the most impressive fortifications. On this day, Americans changed their tactics, attacking under cover of darkness without preliminary artillery bombardment. Japanese defenders were surprised, and many were killed while sleeping. Marines continued to attack across the island yard by yard, destroying Japanese fortifications and sustaining heavy losses. This was not a battle of generals or admirals. This was a battle of individual Marines, privates, corporals, sergeants, lieutenants, advancing yard by yard. The next day, March 8th, 1,000 Japanese charged the American lines in a return to suicidal banzai tactics. Americans suffered 347 casualties, including 90 dead. This attack was a failure, resulting in nearly 900 dead Japanese soldiers out of the 1,000 that attacked. The remaining Japanese defensive positions were split in two as American forces reached the northern coast of the island. This slide was labeled Massachusetts Marines. Shows two of them resting, but I wanted you to see this because, again, the one on the left carrying a Thompson submachine gun, probably with ammunition made here in Evansville. The one on the right is carrying a Browning automatic rifle, I believe. It's a BAR. Ta-da! Again, this is at Suribachi, but notice the Marine in the foreground. What's he got? Ammunition made here in Evansville, M1 carbine. Supplies being unloaded on the beach. Again, LSTs, like the kind made in Evansville. I couldn't locate whether any and which ones were from Evansville in some of these photographs. Final days of the battle. Ladies, don't cheer. March 26th, American forces declared the island secured, but the U.S. Army continued to fight hidden Japanese troops. Even though they declared the battle was over, there were over 3,000 Japanese troops still hiding in the caves and the tunnels. Fighting continued until the Japanese nation surrendered in August 1945. And even then, there were Japanese holdouts, including 2 men who did not surrender until 1949. This shows the final positions. The cost of the battle was extremely high, as we discussed. Of the 70,000 who would eventually land on the island, Americans suffered over 26,000 casualties, including 6,800 dead. That's difficult for us to understand. That many dead, that many casualties. To put it in perspective, 2,400 were killed at Pearl Harbor. Almost 3,000 people were killed in the attack on 9/11. But at Iwo Jima, there were 26,000 casualties amongst the American Marines and Navy and Army. The Battle of Iwo Jima resulted in more casualties than the entire U.S. war in Afghanistan. The Japanese had 21,000 men on the island at the start of the battle. 3,000 fought on until the Japanese surrendered on September 2nd. Ultimately, less than 1,000 were taken prisoner. Significantly, Iwo Jima was the only battle in the Pacific where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. In hindsight, given the number of casualties, the necessity and long-term significance of the island's capture to the outcome of the war became a contentious issue and remains disputed. The island was useless as a staging base for the Army or a fleet base for the Navy. As we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, the justification for Iwo Jima's strategic importance to the U.S. war effort has been that it provided a landing and refueling site for long-range fighter escorts, P-51s. These escorts proved both impractical and unnecessary, and only 10 such missions were flown from Iwo Jima. I don't want it to diminish the valor, the courage, and the suffering of the U.S. Marines. They had a tough job to do, and they did it. But I want us to talk about the cost. B-29 attacks against Japan began on November 29, 1944, before the attack on Iwo Jima. These attacks utilized high-altitude daylight precision bombing against strategic targets like munitions factories, but were ineffective due to weather conditions in Japan, including high winds and cloud cover. These often obscured military targets. By March 9th, the American Army Air Force shifted their tactics to include low-altitude nighttime bombing, carrying a destructive new weapon, napalm bombs, which were highly effective against Japanese houses, which were largely constructed of paper and wood. The pilots feared flying low would expose them to deadly anti-aircraft attacks. But in fact, the Japanese would be the ones who suffered most. In less than 3 hours, more than 300 B-29s destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing more than 83,000. By some counts, up to 100,000 civilians. In fact, it is estimated that this one raid on Tokyo killed more Japanese than either of the 2 atomic bombs, and there were many such low-altitude incendiary attacks against Japanese cities. To put that in perspective, 83,000 killed, that's more than the combined population of Owensboro and Henderson. As early as March 4th, 1945, fighting was still taking place. The first B-29 made an emergency landing on Iwo Jima. Despite enemy fire, the airplane landed without incident and was serviced, refueled, and dispatched. In all, over 2,000 B-29 landings on Iwo Jima were recorded during the war. As for the importance of the island as a landing and refueling site for bombers, it's been suggested that only a small portion of those 2,000 landings were for genuine emergencies. The rest being for minor technical checkups, training, or refueling. The tragic cost of Operation Detachment, the attack on Iwo Jima, pressured veterans, journalists, and commanders to fixate on the most visible rationale for the battle. The sight of the enormous, costly, and technically sophisticated B-29 landing on the islands provided a justification. In fact, this emergency landing thesis counts every B-29 landing on Iwo Jima as an emergency and asserts that capturing the island saved the lives of nearly 25,000 crewmen on the B-29s. However, of nearly 2,000 landings, more than 80% were for routine refueling. Several hundred landings were made for training purposes, and most of the remainder were for relatively minor engine maintenance. Very few were for actual combat damage. The argument continues to this day. Did the cost and Marine casualties justify the potential loss of B-29 crewmen? I will say that the lessons learned on Iwo Jima served as guidelines for the following Battle of Okinawa and the planned invasion of the Japanese homeland. For example, because of the casualties taken at Iwo Jima, it was decided to increase the duration and level of the preparatory bombardment prior to the landing on Iwo Jima or Okinawa. As in the planning for potential attack on the Japanese homeland islands, it was taken into account that a third of the troops committed to Iwo Jima and Okinawa were casualties. It was estimated that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost the Allies over 1 million casualties. I think that sobering effect had a significant impact on President Truman's decision to utilize the atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daryl. Does anybody have any questions?
Richard Kissel. The Germans were the first ones to use flamethrowers. When was Americans first used against the Japanese and what island?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I know they were equipped as early as Guadalcanal with flamethrowers, but I'm not sure of the exact answer for that question. I know they had flamethrowers at Normandy Beach in Europe, too.
Kathy Rader has a microphone for you, right behind you.
I heard the question. What happened to the islands? So Iwo Jima was considered a home island of the Japanese Empire, and it's owned by the Japanese now. It's only open one day a year for visits, and it's very strictly controlled who gets to, attend those visits. But there's not a civilian population on the island, is my understanding.
Yes, Brian Brethold is the name. A couple of interesting facts. On your Amtraks, there were two different ones that they used. The one with the turret on there was the heavier one. That was called a Buffalo. The lighter one was the Alligator. On the picture that you showed of the Marine Monument on top of Suribachi, okay, the group that raised that flag, there were 257 of those people went up that hill. 27 of them survived. The last person there that their hand is not on the flag is Ira Hayes, and he was a Medal of Honor winner. He was a Pima Indian from Arizona, and he ended up actually killing himself with alcohol because they wouldn't let him go back to battle. They pulled him over here for war bond drives, and he couldn't go back, and he ended up drinking himself to death out in Arizona.
Johnny Cash wrote a song about him.
Can you hear? Okay, I was going to say there's one other Evansville link to your conversation, and that is when the Chrysler plant started shutting down making 45 caliber ammunition. The next thing they were starting to work on was incendiaries for the firebombing campaign. So a lot of the firebombs came out of Evansville.
Kathy asked me who Kevin Reed is, now I can tell her who he is.
Can you hear me? I have only one observation to make, and that is that my father went ashore on Iwo on day 3. He was Army Air Corps. I heard nothing in my childhood and young adult life but funny, amusing stories about experiences he had with 2 guys that shared a foxhole with him, and they appropriated a generator and had lights through a light trap and 24-hour poker games. I mean, these were the stories that I heard as a kid. My mother had passed away, and my dad got a phone call from the nephew of his CO. And he had realized that they had never had any kind of reunion for his outfit. So they decided to have one while there were still a few of the guys able to go. And they had it in Southern California, which is where they had parted. And my dad had lost some of his vision and thought, well, maybe he shouldn't go. And I said, no, if one of those guys that you've been in this phone chain with is going to be there, let's go. I'll go with you. And so I did. And my friend Linda went along, and we were flanking my father as he's making his way through this. And he ran into guys that he had been there for a long time, because he went in on day 3 and didn't leave until the end of the war. And I heard the most blood-curdling, awful stories, because they were men who had shared that experience and could only talk about it with other men who had that same experience. And I suspect that's true of many of us whose parents or grandparents have served in the military and had that experience. It's an experience that merits discussion, but can only be shared with someone who's had that same experience. And I think this allows a lot of people to at least revisit that and have some sense of what their loved ones went through.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I will tell you one other thing. My dad, once the hostilities had pretty well settled down, somebody was using a projector to put photographs that the men had, and they were projecting it against Mount Suribachi. And my dad's standing in line with the picture of his fiance, and he looks up and sees a picture of my mother and he's holding the picture, and he thinks, what's going on? So he scurried around and found out who was and it was my mother's next door neighbor, who also happened to be on Iwo. So you never know. Okay.
Thank you.
So my name's Bob Ryder. I'm with the Marine Corps League here in Evansville, and I have a little presentation for you.
Oh my.
It's a framed picture of the flag raising you see behind you. But a little better than that, as he mentioned, one airplane a year gets to go in, and originally it was only veterans of the battle who could go, but in later years there were not any veterans left to go, so they opened it to children of veterans who fought on Iwo. We had a young man come to one of our meetings whose father had been on Iwo. He went on the trip and acquired a couple of bottles of Iwo Jima sand, which he gave to us. Acquired is a good word. So here is a little plaque with details from the battle and a small vial of actual Iwo sand.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Question back here.
Yeah, my dad landed on Iwo Jima, was wounded, and went on the fight to Saipan, and Marion Island.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. My father was landed on Iwo Jima, was wounded, and went on to fight in Saipan, Kenya, and the Mariana Islands. And today is the 20th year of his death.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for your sacrifice.
Daryl, thank you for coming today, and I'd like to invite everybody back. In 2 weeks, we're going to find out about aerial reconnaissance over North Korea through a B-36 and developing those same photos on the return flight. And Stephanie Pitchers will be talking about World War II fashion design for the ladies. Thanks. See you in 2 weeks.
Yes.